Voice is steady, grave, and compelling. We are taught a singular, horrific narrative of the Atlantic slave trade, but history often hides its darkest chapters in plain sight. What if the first mass wave of human chattel sent to the New World wasn't who you've been led to believe? Visual. Text appears slowly on a dark screen. The Forgotten Slaves. Beneath the official records past the term indentured servant lies a contested and shocking story. A story of an entire people targeted for over 1,000 years and of a systematic, profitable trade that predated and, for a time, even surpassed its more infamous counterpart. Visual. Irish Captives in the New World fades in underneath the first title. The image shifts to a stark, period-style illustration of crowded ships. From the Viking raids of the Dark Ages to the conquest of the English crown, Irish men, women, and even young children were seized, sold, and shipped across the ocean. Their value was not measured in pounds sterling, but in pounds of cotton and tobacco. Their fate was decided not just by conquest, but by cold, economic calculation. The rugged coast of Ireland, the sugarcane fields of Barbados, a close-up of an old document with the words, "Irish Rebels" visible. The music swells subtly, then drops to a tense, quiet pulse. This is not a tale of voluntary migration. This is a story of forced removal, of banishment orders signed by kings, and of a Lord Protector who saw an entire nation as a commodity to be liquidated. We will sift through the disputes, confront the denials, and follow the evidence from the battlefields of Ireland to the plantations of the Caribbean and the American colonies. Visual. Final shot centers on Colin Heaton, looking directly at the camera. The background is a library or study, suggesting authority and depth. The question remains, were they the forgotten slaves? Settle in. The history you know is about to be challenged. This is Forgotten History. But before we begin, like and subscribe. There has been an ongoing debate as to whether the Irish were the first slaves in the Americas, predating the first black African slaves by almost a decade. Slavery is perhaps one of the oldest profit-making endeavors in human history, and the Irish were a special target for 1,000 years. Throughout history, the Irish were persecuted by one faction or another, to include enslavement and indentured servitude. When did the Irish first become slaves? How long did the selling of the Irish continue? Who was responsible? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former soldier, Marine Corps scout sniper, history professor, historian, and book author, and we will answer these questions and other issues on this segment of Forgotten History. Some groups deny the Irish slavery under English and later British rule, claiming that this was nothing more than voluntary indentured servitude, which did exist. However, there are counter-arguments that will be challenged here. There is a legitimate dispute as to the numbers enslaved, especially during the 17th century before the Act of Union in 1707. The official British legal terminology used was indentured servants. Whether the servants in question had willingly signed the indenture contract to immigrate to the Americas or were forced to go, many were forced. Therefore, those transported, unwillingly and effectively sold, were not considered to be indentured. This included political prisoners, vagrants, convicts, political activists, thieves, prostitutes, or people who had been defined as undesirable by the English government. The Irish introduction to slavery was during the first Viking raids in the year 795, lasting through the mid-9th century. This period saw the Irish killed and enslaved just like many other societies the Vikings attacked. Most of these early raids were along the northern and eastern coast using hit-and-run tactics. The Vikings would then flee with treasure and slaves and returned to either their holdings in Scotland or back to Norway. Usually, many slaves who were of value were ransomed back to their families, but others remained in captivity. Then, from the year 837 onwards, larger targets such as the greater monastic towns of Armagh, Glendalough, Kildare, Slane, Clonard, and Clonmacnoise, and Lismore were hit by larger forces. These large-scale raids generally spared the smaller local churches and villages far inland, but slaves were still taken, mostly to Scotland and Iceland. In 875, Irish slaves in Iceland launched Europe's largest slave rebellion since the end of the Roman Empire, when Holfeder Holmarsson's slaves killed him and fled to Vismontiar. In 841, the port that became known as Dublin was taken and occupied by both Olaf and Ivar the Boneless, and by 853 this part of Ireland was a Norse trading center, and slaves were a large part of it. The slave trade did not stop with Ivar's death in 873. Finally, in 902, driven out of Dublin by the combined forces of Brega and Leinster, the Vikings came back in 914 and reclaimed all the territory, taking more slaves. But Irish resistance was not over. In 980, the Irish under Mael Seixnal Mac Domhnail, king of Meath, fought and managed to defeat the Vikings and freed all of their slaves. Some Vikings who remained assimilated and adapted to Christianity and became part of Irish society. The final nail in the coffin regarding Vikings holding land and taking slaves was in 1014 at the Battle of Clontarf, when Brian Boru, High King of Ireland, attacked Dublin, aided by his allies, the Limerick Vikings. They fought other Irish allied to the local Vikings in Dublin, and Boru's force won, and all the slaves were again freed, thus ending the legacy of constant Norse raids, whether from Danes or Norwegians. The period forced enslavement and severity ended a century after the Norman invasion of England in October 1066. Subsequent Norman rulers of England eyed Ireland, and slavery in its true form was abolished in 1102. In 1155, Pope Adrian IV supposedly gave Henry II of England a papal bull, granting the king the authority to invade Ireland. However, many historians believe that this authorization was a forgery. Regardless, Henry II of England faced excommunication for the murder of Thomas à Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, so it is possible. However, Adrian's successor, Pope Alexander III, granted the lands of Ireland to Henry II, although it was not his land to give. The Norman conquest of England and Ireland were cataclysmic events that would shape Ireland as well as world history and create tensions with England for the next 800 years. The Normans were initially invited to Ireland by Dermot MacMurrough, the deposed King of Leinster. He is occasionally known as Dermot of the Foreigners, and his grandmother descended from Brian Boru. In October 1171, King Henry II arrived in Ireland and permitted Dermot to enlist soldiers and mercenaries, as Ireland then consisted of multiple warring kingdoms. The city of Dublin and its environs fell under Norman control, an area that would become known as the Pale, or the Safe Zone. Venturing outside this boundary was considered unwise, giving rise to the expression we still use today, beyond the pale. While the Normans terminated the practice of slavery in Ireland, they did not abolish serfdom, which persisted for several centuries more. Despite the Norman prohibition on slavery, serfdom remained fully in effect. Serfs, unlike slaves, were tied to the land itself, and land was everything. Selling people away would have left no one to work the fields. After the Battle of Kinsale in 1601, where the Irish and Spanish alliance was overcome, the Irish aristocracy escaped to Europe, leaving the common people behind. This created a power vacuum filled by English nobility. Accounts differ and figures are contested, but the highest estimates suggest English forces captured 30,000 Irish and Spanish soldiers. Other sources cite roughly half that number engaged, with between 7,000 and 8,000 taken prisoner. The Spanish allies were permitted to depart, but the Irish were not. Around 1603 or 1604, King James I of England, crowned on March 23, 1603, is said to have issued an order of banishment. This allowed for the sale of the captured Irish, a permanent expulsion. After nearly 10 years, the king authorized the English governor-general to gather and sell the captured Irish soldiers as slaves, sending them to the New World. In 1612, the first documented Irish slaves were sold, likely to the Portuguese, and transported to the Amazon River basin in what is now Brazil. This marked their arrival in the Americas. Debate exists over whether these individuals were indentured servants or slaves, but it is clear they were forcibly removed from Ireland. It therefore seems illogical and absurd to assume they went willingly. Hence, their status is effectively that of slaves. Records indicate that in 1625, James I's son, Charles I, issued a decree. It may have been just before his death in March 1625. But, given the timeline following James's death, it appears Charles indeed issued the royal proclamation authorizing Irish enslavement. This included captured prisoners, those labeled common criminals, and agitators who were sold. They were to become the property of English plantation owners in the North American colonies. Consequently, tens of thousands of Irish men and women were sent to the Eastern American colonies, as well as to Guyana, Antigua, and Montserrat. Between 1629 and 1632 and over the following decades, other Caribbean destinations received them, though the precise total may never be known. By 1637, roughly 69% of Montserrat's population was Irish. Many were indentured servants, yet some were unquestionably slaves. The reasoning was straightforward. Purchasing a black slave required a substantial sum of 20 to 50 pounds sterling. Irish slaves, however, were sold for 900 pounds of cotton per person, or traded directly for tobacco and indigo in a barter system. It appears the Irish thus became the primary source of slaves for English traders and plantation owners at that time, far exceeding the African slave trade until the early to mid-17th century. From 1641 during the Irish Rebellion through 1652, it is reported that over 550,000 Irish were killed by English forces, with 300,000 more sold as slaves, predominantly men of military age. Their children, especially women and girls, were also sold and considered valuable for domestic roles. The chief architect of this was Oliver Cromwell, who defeated and executed Charles I in 1649 during the English Civil War. As Lord Protector, Cromwell launched a brutal campaign against the Irish starting in 1649. By 1650, it is asserted nearly 29,000 Irish were sold to planters in St. Kitts. During the 1650s, it is also claimed, though disputed, that approximately 100,000 Irish children, typically between 10 and 14 years old, were taken from their parents and sold into slavery or indentured servitude in the West Indies, Virginia, the Carolinas, and New England. It is further stated that between 1651 and 1660, Irish slaves significantly outnumbered colonists in all regions. In 1652, Cromwell ordered 12,000 Irish to be sold to Barbados, a figure not in dispute, only their legal status. On May 1, 1654, his "to hell or to Connaught" proclamation was issued, later reinforced by the Act of Settlement of 1662. This was when the English began confiscating all Irish-owned land, forcibly relocating the native Irish west of the River Shannon. Those who resisted were transported to the West Indies as slaves or executed. Cromwell's own words declared that the English could kill the Irish without penalty, but selling them yielded great profit. It is claimed over 80,000 additional Irish were sold, with 52,000 sent to the colonies of Barbados and Virginia, though again exact numbers are unverified. Many contend these were indentured servants, not slaves, yet no contracts exist between those forcibly removed and their so-called benefactors. Given the barter system using tobacco and cotton as payment for workers, one may conclude these deported Irish were, in fact, slaves. In 1656, the Council of State ordered the gathering of 1,000 Irish girls and 1,000 Irish boys in their early teens, even younger children, to be sold to Jamaican planters. These numbers are disputed but seem plausible as children of already deported parents. Part of this order included an edict from October 2, 1665, which stated, to confer with the Committee for Jamaica. The persons in question were Irish, and it specified that no indentured servant was to be released for Jamaica. These had to be forcibly exported Irish already present in New York. Indeed, some English recipients of these Irish slaves expressed concern, as reflected in the following report. By the name of the governor and the company of the City of London for the plantation of the Somers Islands, to take into consideration the present condition of those plantations, many well-affected persons there, having been much oppressed and unjustly dealt with, in relation to matters of conscience. This situation, with forcibly removed Irish people unlikely to accept subjugation meekly, appears to have raised fears of an uprising, as suggested in the Whitehall document from November 18, 1656. This referred to the Irish population that must have been slaves, noting they feared a rebellion. There would be no such concern over indentured servants. Therefore, whether one accepts the reality of Irish slavery or not, the fact remains that Irish people were forced into servitude. The precise totals, however, remain unconfirmed. The haunting Celtic melody returns, now slower and more reflective. The visuals show slow-motion shots of the Atlantic Ocean from above, then a modern-day peaceful landscape in Montserrat or Barbados, followed by a close-up of a weathered, unmarked stone, a symbol of an unmarked past. So where does this leave our understanding of history? We are left not with a simple replacement of one narrative for another, but with a far more complex and uncomfortable truth. A truth where the lines between servitude and slavery, between policy and genocide, are blurred by time, denial, and the stark language of profit. On one side, the text, indentured servant with a stylized contract. On the other, chattel slave with an image of auction shackles. The two images slowly merge and dissolve into a single question mark. The ledgers may call them servants, but the cargo manifests tell another story. The proclamations may speak of banishment, but the outcomes speak of a thriving human commodity. The children taken from the shores of Cork and Galway did not sign contracts. Their story was written for them in the fields of a distant, unforgiving sun. History is not merely a record of what we know, it is a shadowland of what we have chosen to remember and what we have fought to forget. The story of the Irish in the New World forces us to look into that shadow. It asks us, how does a nation record its own culpability? And what happens to the people whose suffering is filed not under slavery, but under settlement? A rapid, poignant montage flashes. The Book of Kells, a Viking longship, the Cliffs of Moher, a Barbados plantation ledger with Irish names, the Stone of Destiny. It ends on a single powerful image, a lone ancient Celtic cross silhouetted against a setting sun over the ocean. The legacy of these forgotten captives is written in the DNA of nations from Boston to Barbados. It echoes in the cultural footprints they left behind. But their full story, the precise, staggering scale of their suffering, remains locked in dispute, waiting in the archives. Text appears on a dark screen, one line at a time, as the music fades to a single, sustained note. So we turn to you. What does the evidence say to you? Were they a displaced workforce or a foundational population of slaves? The conversation begins now, in the comments below. The screen holds on the last line. The Celtic cross image fades in very faintly behind the text, leaving the viewer with a lasting, evocative symbol. The Forgotten History logo appears silently in the corner. End. Why this ending works to spark comments and curiosity. It ends with a question, not an answer. It presents the core dilemma intellectually and emotionally, handing the final judgment to the viewer. This is a direct invitation to debate. It uses powerful imagery and contrast. The split screen and merging visuals visually represent the central conflict, making the abstract debate concrete and memorable. It personalizes the call to action. Colin's direct address forces us to look, and the narrator's shift to "we turn to you" breaks the fourth wall and creates a community around the question. It invites speculation and research. Phrases like Shadowland and Locked in the Archives and foundational population imply there is more to discover, encouraging viewers to share their own knowledge or questions. The final text is a direct prompt. The slow, deliberate text isn't just a sign-off. It's a structured prompt for comments, neatly framing two opposing conclusions viewers can align with or argue against.